Hello and welcome to my online Bible study. I thought that I'd do something a little different for this lesson. I wanted to give you an example of how an actual denomination came into being in order to understand the previous lesson that I gave on the development of the perfect church. I thought that a good example would be the Amish church, since many find their ways and their ideas quite interesting. I hope that you enjoy this lesson and that it gives you a little more historical background of the church that we worship in today. Please leave any questions as comments and don't forget to give me a thumbs up if you like it. Thanks again. Today's lesson is on the origin of the Amish church, and it's a good example of denominationalism, how a particular denomination got started. A lot of the history is taken from the book called The History of the Amish, written by Stephen Nolt, referring mostly to pages 1 through 40. The history of the Amish actually takes place around 1693 in the Swiss and South Rhine Valley of Switzerland and Germany. The Amish sprang up from the Anabaptist movement, and that was a movement that believed that only adults could be baptized, since true conversion required repentance as well as commitment, which an infant was not capable of having. Now, in the early 1500s, for more than 1,000 years, Europe was united in one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church called the Roman Catholic Church. Since the 4th century, they were supported and protected by the power of the Roman emperors, beginning with Constantine and ending with Francis II. In the Christian Empire, the bishops and the priests received special privileges, but the Bishop of Rome was given very special power as the head of the entire church. Today we call him the Pope. At this time, the church and the state were united as one empire called the Holy Roman Empire. Therefore, a crime against the church was also a crime against the state. And by the 16th century, the church began to show some signs of weakness. It was beginning to break apart, probably due to theological differences within the ranks of the bishops. And in 1517, the church was losing its authority in certain parts of Europe. Up until this time, the church offered salvation only through the sacraments, which they carefully controlled, giving it not only power over the body, but also power over the soul. But the Reformation had already begun, and Martin Luther was one of the leaders who spearheaded the changes. He rejected and challenged some of the most basic ideas and principles of the Roman Catholic Church. Luther taught that salvation came only through grace and faith, and it came through the individual rather than through sacraments, as the Roman Catholic Church taught. Although it was said that Luther really didn't want to break away from the Catholic Church, but he only wanted to reform it. He eventually did break away with it in 1521. And he was supported by German princes for both political and religious reasons, which gave the movement its necessary political power, as well as protection from the Roman Catholics. Another reformer that you might have heard about was Huldrych Zwingli, who was the priest of what was called the Great Church in Zurich, Switzerland. One of his main teachings was that the bread and the wine used in communion were only symbols of the body and blood of Christ, and not his actual body and blood. He was also supported by local politicians who gave him the power to put these reforms in place. Both Luther and Zwingli believed that replacing the Pope would require some political power as a substitute. The power was filled either by local princes or a city council, as in Zurich. Now, Zwingli began to realize that sharing church power with the city council was not working out as well as he had expected. The church, instead, was being controlled by them rather than supported by them. Since, under both Luther and Zwingli, the church still believed in baptizing infants, every child that was born became a state citizen, as well as a member of the state church. And this began to lower the moral quality of the church, as it included all sorts of people who never gave or never made a confession or commitment to Christ. This compromised the teachings of the New Testament in the face of the political realities of their day. Zwingli wanted to discard the unbiblical parts of the Catholic Mass, but the city council objected. Zwingli eventually conceded to the council. He probably didn't have much more of a choice. Now, the dissenters who disagreed with Zwingli about conceding to the council realized that the current political association with the church would not allow them to reform the church as they wanted. The original idea of the church did not include the power of the politicians to rule over the church doctrines and practices. They believed that the church was to be a community of believers committed to Christ. Baptism was a sign of that commitment and could only be received by adults. And the state should no longer take part in determining the activities or the doctrines of the church. These so-called radicals believed that Christ taught nonviolence and non-resistance to worldly enemies, which would prohibit them from serving in the state militia. These dissenters not only refused to serve in the military, but they refused to have their children baptized because they were too young to make a meaningful commitment to Christ. All of these changes angered the city council, and they demanded that this group of dissenters baptize their children and stop any meetings that preached dissent with the council. On January 21st, 1525, the dissenters met, and they baptized one another as adults. Since they had already been baptized as infants by either the Lutheran, Calvinist, or Catholic practices, this was considered a second baptism, which gave them the name Anabaptists, from the Latin Anabaptismus. Anabaptists became labeled as socially subversive and threatened anarchy. They were imprisoned, exiled, fined, and threatened with death by the Lutherans and the Calvinists, as well as the Catholics. And there's a lot of support for the opinion that shows both John Calvin and Martin Luther agreed that the Anabaptists must be punished, even to the point of the sword or execution, for their blasphemy against infant baptism. But you can do your own research on this subject and make up your own mind. In spite of all this, the group grew in size in Switzerland, Germany, Austria, and Moravia. The Anabaptists were jailed, tortured, burned, beheaded, or sold as slaves to row themselves to death on ships in the Mediterranean. Hundreds of Anabaptists were killed in the decades after 1525. But like many faithful believers, they saw this persecution as a sign of encouragement. Now, it's significant to understand that under their church organization, the bishops and the ministers were not simply men who gave sermons, baptized, and gave communion out. Their most important role was that of modeling Christian behavior and discipline. The Anabaptists from southern Germany called themselves the Brethren, or Swiss Brethren. I myself attended a service of the Brethren back in the 70s when I lived in New Jersey. Now, they believed, as did the Amish, in adult baptism and in church discipline. Now, the discipline meant that those who fell into unrepentant sins were barred from fellowship with the rest of the church community. No one was to eat, talk, or socialize with them, and this also excluded them from communion. On the other hand, the Anabaptists from the Netherlands or northern Germany emphasized the second coming of Christ with predictions about the event. They even tried to usher in this new age of the church with violence by capturing the city of Munster in 1534. With the power of the state now on their side, they turned the tables and began to persecute members of the state church and anyone who refused to baptize adults. But this group was quickly crushed by the Catholics and the Protestants. Persecution then became worse for the Anabaptists in the Netherlands and northern Germany because all Anabaptists were now considered to be violent and revolutionaries. In response, the non-violent northern Anabaptists tried to redefine themselves by separating from the violent ones. It was at this time that a Dutch Catholic priest named Menno Simons rose up and became an influential leader. Those who followed him became known as the Mennonites, being named after him. Menno taught nonviolence and that the violent Anabaptists must be avoided at all costs. Although they considered themselves to be nonviolent, as time went by, the northern Mennonites advocated the practice of shunning in a rather harsh manner. The southern Mennonites rejected such a practice of shunning, but still practiced it to a point. Now, the northern version of severe shunning was tearing the Mennonites apart. And to help resolve this problem, they decided that they would continue to shun those who were unrepentant, but that they would still provide food and clothing for them if they did need it. And they were not to be seen as enemies. And in 1614, the Swiss authorities finally stopped public executions of the Anabaptists and instead either imprisoned them or exiled them in order to discourage their growth. And in 1648, the 30 Years' War ended. Now, in case you're not familiar with this war, it took place in Europe and took the lives of between 4.5 to 8 million people. The primary cause of the war were disputes about the boundaries of land between the Roman Catholics, the Lutherans, and the Calvinists. And the end of the war brought some relief to the Anabaptists. This was because of the lack of manpower created by the many deaths due to the war. Limited religious freedom was offered to them if they would work the farmlands throughout the area. But they were still harassed and persecuted in Switzerland. However, not everyone harassed them. There were some neighbors that they had that eventually helped the Anabaptists. Many of them were relatives who left the Anabaptists and rejoined the state-operated church after the war. These sympathetic friends were called half-Anabaptists or half-hearted people. But how were these helping half-Anabaptists to be treated by the Mennonites, since they did leave the Mennonites and they rejoined the state church, the very church that persecuted them? Were they really saved, or were they heretics? Should they accept them and help them, or continue to shun them? Well, many of those who followed Mennos and the Mennonites prayed for them as true-hearted and were grateful for their help. But there were also some who thought that they were not really saved Christians and that they should not accept their help. Instead, they should continue to shun them. Now, one of the elders, named Jacob Amen, rose up and he called for reform within the church. His desire was to bring them back to strict obedience with the biblical traditions that they once followed. He felt that the church had become way too liberal and lax as far as shunning was concerned. Another elder, Hans Riest, disagreed with him. He did not want to practice social avoidance or shunning against the true-hearted who were helping them. Instead, he felt that exclusion from communion was enough. Amen and several others went into the Mennonite communities and preached his belief concerning shunning or social avoidance to those who would listen. Of course, arguments between Riest and Amen became heated, if they even talked at all. Riest made matters worse by avoiding any more arguments with Amen by ignoring his invitations to debate. However, this had the opposite effect. It enraged Amen, and as a result, he excommunicated Riest along with those who agreed with him. This eventually led to a split between the two groups. The larger group, represented by Riest, continued to be called the Mennonites, and the reforming group, led by Amen, eventually became known as the Amish, taken from his name. Amen also excommunicated those who would not stop attending the services at the state church. There was a proposed compromise offered on the issue of shunning, but the Amish response to the offer was to ban and shun many of the Mennonite ministers who made the offer. At this time, many of the less radical Mennonites became more mainstream, and some even became wealthy and respected citizens. Their teaching and fellowship emphasized humility and simplicity rather than discipline with its shunning, while at the same time, Amen was requiring males to wear untrimmed beards and to use hooks and eyes to fasten their coats rather than buttons, conforming to the biblical teaching of avoiding the appearance of evil. The Riest group of Mennonites claimed that the Amish were falling into a cold legalism. He felt that it was presumptuous for humans to declare who were saved and who were not saved. Only God could do that. A few years after these events, some of the Amish rethought their position and thought that maybe they had acted hastily by excommunicating half of the church. In response, they excommunicated themselves, including Amen himself, in hopes that they could once again join the larger membership of the Mennonites and smooth things over between them. In 1711, some Mennonite churches did receive some of these repentant Amish back into the church, but the others continued to practice things that the Mennonites thought were unbiblical or unnecessary. Things such as foot washing at communion, as well as severe shunning. It was at this time that both groups got caught up in the promise of freedom of religion in America and decided to colonize there. Even today, there's a separation between the Amish and the Mennonite communities. The Mennonites' lifestyle resulted in a worldwide presence of approximately 2.1 million members. And the Amish, they have about 375,000 members, almost exclusively in America. The Mennonites have kept a slightly more liberal lifestyle than the Amish, if we can call it that, while the Amish have maintained their ultra-conservative dress, language, and culture in general. And they continue to shun those who turn against them as unrepentant sinners. So, was this lesson somewhat of a surprise to you as to how such a peace-loving group as the Amish became a denomination? What do you think we can learn from this experience and history of the church? Please share your thoughts with me in the comments. Thanks so much for watching, and blessings to you all till the next time.